So this is the obesity paradox. Part 1, a paradox for the ages. Chapter 5, getting to the fat of the matter, the obesity paradox. A good paradox in science is an excellent problem to have if you're looking for the truth. It opens the door to new information, challenging long-held assumptions, and compelling scientists to revisit definitions carved in referenced books. It's equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. This brings us to the obesity paradox. While obesity, particularly the severe type, is associated with higher mortality rates in the general population, modest overweightness, or mild obesity, can confer a survival advantage and increase our longevity. As we've started to discuss, in study after study, overweight and moderately obese patients with certain chronic diseases often live longer and fare better than their normal weight patients with the same ailments. How could this be possible? So now we have the French paradox, one of the most famous paradoxes in recent memory to emerge in science, which has since helped us to embrace such anomalies, is the French paradox. In the 1950s, French epidemiologists noticed that their fellow countrymen and women boasted low incidence of coronary heart disease despite their high intakes of cholesterol and saturated fats. Given what we thought we knew about the relationship between consuming a high-fat diet and the risk for heart disease, this didn't make sense. It was partially hearsay to suggest that dietary fat had nothing to do with heart disease. A typical French person eats more than 40 pounds of cheese per year, and a glance at any lunch would make most heart health conscious Americans queasy. Despite their fatty indulgences at meals, many of the French continue to enjoy relatively good health. They are famous for having lower rates of heart disease and obesity than Americans. Something about their diets is protecting them from the fate many of us experience when we consume too much artery clogging fat. No doubt something about their lifestyle is offering protection too. For many people in France and Europe, probably do more physical activity than typical Americans. The French paradox quickly became a subject of intrigue among scientists around the world, and today numerous theories exist to help explain it. The French keep close tabs on their portions, and they love their wine, especially red, which is known to have a flushing effect on the bloodstream by removing blood platelets, essentially preventing those cells from clinging to arterial walls and creating deadly plaques. The French paradox poked alarming holes in our collective medical knowledge, and it continues to be a popular field of inquiry because it has so many implications for anyone who wants to avoid heart disease. My guess is the obesity paradox will likewise shift how we perceive body fat and the factors that contribute to health, pointing as it does to an inverse relationship between body fat and the risk of death in many cases. In the French paradox, red wine seems to be one of the magic potions for preventing heart disease, despite the prevalence of saturated fat in the French diet. The other piece of magic is likely more physical activity and exercise. In the obesity paradox, cardiorespiratory fitness and muscle mass seem to work as a dynamic duo, helping stave off the ills that excess body fat can otherwise have. The story of the obesity paradox. I first started to document this paradox in 2002 when analyzing several patients with heart failure who were overweight or obese, but nonetheless living longer than thinner equals with the same heart problems. It didn't make sense. If obesity was bad for your heart health, then how could it be beneficial in surviving heart disease? There had been some recently published studies that suggested that in patients with chronic systolic heart failure, obesity was associated with better survival. But those studies had failed to evaluate more comprehensive body composition parameters, such as percentage of body fat, body mass index, total fat, and body surface area. The individuals who lived the longest were the fattest. We were even able to put a percentage on the risk for death in relationship to body fat. For every 1% increase in body fat, there was a 13% increase in survival. In our conclusion, we were very cautious about our findings, stating that we didn't know if the links we'd identified was causal or merely association. We called for more studies to confirm the connection, figure out if extra body fat was the real reason behind a better survival rate, and identified the underlying mechanism. Although the obesity paradox has been discounted by some experts, who have suggested that it may be due to such factors as sample size error or variables that weren't tracked and measured, even very large meta-analyses that compile multiple studies have demonstrated this biological paradox in heart patients, most of them correcting for smoking and even some correcting for smoking-induced lung diseases. The overweight individuals had the lowest relative risk, whereas obesity and severe obesity had no increased mortality risk. These results were published in The Lancet in 2006. 2 years later, a similar study by a friend and colleague evaluated 29,000 patients from 9 major heart failure studies and collaborated the same pattern. The overweight and obese folks with heart disease were less likely to die than normal weight patients with heart disease. As noted in the first chapter, the most compelling findings, giving indisputable credibility to the obesity paradox, have nothing to do with heart disease and everything to do with other conditions. The obesity paradox has been documented in a host of other conditions such as arthritis, kidney disease, diabetes, cancer, and even HIV infection. Although we may assume that being overweight with these conditions will make them all the more challenging to manage, treat, and combat, the evidence reveals the contrary. People with these ailments who are overweight or even mildly obese fare better in the long run than their normal weight counterparts. Go figure. The facts of the matter. See what they did there? The C, so it's fats, haha. Anyway, before we get into the detail of the 4 main explanations for the obesity paradox, I want to remind you about 2 facts that should always be kept in mind. One is that fat helps guard the body from damage, particularly as we age, and are more prone to injury and falls. It literally provides a physical barrier against traumatic injuries. Second is that the body mass index formula is flawed. These 2 facts alone help explain the obesity paradox from a very general standpoint. But, as they say in infomercials, wait, there's more. The power of extra reserves. Anytime the body is fighting an illness or shouldering the weight of a chronic disease, it requires more energy and higher caloric reserves than usual. So it makes sense that extra weight in the form of body fat is helpful. It's well documented that fat tissue and fatty molecules circulating in the blood play a role in reducing some of the deleterious effects seen in chronic diseases. So, the more body fat you have, the more ammunition you have in your arsenal to combat sickness and keep those troops well fed. Remember, too, that location matters. The power of genetics and your environment. We can't deny the impact that certain gene variants have on people to make them more or less susceptible to illness, as well as put them at much greater risk of death once they become ill. Seemingly healthy, slim people who develop diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or another chronic ailment could simply have their genes to blame. Unfortunately, thin people patients often are not treated as aggressively because there's a built-in bias towards thinking they are healthy. By the same token, overweight and obese people may receive earlier and more proactive care as a result of their obvious condition. So some of these obese people who fare better than their thinner comrades could attribute their prognosis to superior genes, as well as more attention to their health in general. That said, we cannot forget that the more we learn about genetic makeup, the more we realize that our environment plays a much bigger role in how our DNA expresses itself than we ever imagine. Genes are seldom the sole predictors of our destiny. The environment, which combines overlapping influences from diet and exercise to exposure to toxins and stress, can both directly and indirectly impact our health risks. As I've shown, staying fit can contribute immensely to physical health, but it can enhance genetic health too, affecting longevity. Dietary choices and exercise are two of the biggest environmental factors that influence the state of our metabolic health, and whether or not our body fat helps us or hurts us. The power of fitness. Much of what we know about the link between obesity and health has been derived from research from the Framingham Heart Study, which has followed nearly 15,000 men and women since the 1940s. But sometimes Framingham, and other longitude studies have failed to take into account physical activity and fitness. Only in the past several years have we been able to distinguish weight and fitness in terms of health. While the importance of dietary factors continues to be squarely placed in the picture of health, we now have a new piece of data to consider. Indeed, it's much better for your health if you're fat and fit than thin and unfit, as Chapter 4 conveyed. Your fitness level, encompassing both muscle mass and cardiorespiratory fitness, is a far more important predictor of your risk of dying than just knowing what you weigh. The impact of fitness on genetic expression cannot be understood. As I outlined in the previous chapter, this is where some of the most proactive research has taken place lately, as scientists work to demonstrate how regular exercise can turn on our youth genes and keep potentially harmful genes from blinking on. Fitness could very well be the single most important ingredient to living as long as possible, despite all the other risk factors we bear. The unfortunate power of the bias. Are we asking the right questions and approaching the right problems in the first place? I think it's fair to say that we've gotten so used to framing health issues in terms of obesity that we could be overlooking other potential causes of disease. We assume that obesity and its underlying content, fat, is inherently and invariably bad. But if we're less judgmental when we consider the data, we can often find confounding factors that can explain the disease associations we blame on weight. So, where's the sweet spot? It's a question that I find many ask once they've started to digest some of the characteristics of the obesity paradox. If fat has a good side, then what is the ideal amount to have if we want to avoid not just heart disease, but any life-threatening conditions? Let's turn to two revealing studies, one of which I mentioned in Chapter 1, was published in JAMA around New Year's in 2013, because it suggested that the ideal body mass index to have is between 25 and 30. The study was met with scorn in the scientific community, but it really began in 2005 when the study's lead author analyzed the data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. She found that the biggest risk of death were associated with being at the far edges either way, either underweight or severely obese. The lowest mortality risks were among those in the overweight category, which is BMIs of 25 to 30, and the moderately obese of BMIs from 30 to 35, with no risk of being in the normal weight category. So what this is saying, so flash forward a few years to the second study. Dr. Flegnell and her colleagues at the Center of Disease Control and Prevention's National Center for Health Statistics decided to confirm the previous study further when they reviewed 97 separate studies encompassing a staggering 2.9 million people. After all, when one study proves a point, it helps to keep proving it again and again with even bigger populations. And this study arrived at the same conclusion. People who were in the BMI range of 25 to 30 were better off than those in the normal weight categories. The pervasive and narrow-minded focus on weight loss, irrespective of fitness, in our culture is not good news. As the population ages, the number of men and women suffering from chronic conditions is expected to skyrocket. My hope is that the latest science gains traction in our general health community.